How have the Marlins been effective in developing their players this season? We're going to break that all down in today's Locked On Marlins.
You are Locked On Marlins, your daily podcast on the Miami Marlins.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Marlins. I'm your host, Jeremiah Geiger. I've been podcasting about the Marlins for 4 seasons. This is my 4th season podcasting about this team, helped out by Ely Sussman, who was my very first guest back on my old podcast. But thank you for making Locked On Marlins your first listen of the day. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which is your team every day. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. And on today's show, I am joined by Ely Sussman from Fish on First. Eli, welcome in. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for inviting me back on, Jeremiah. I'll only be the latest one to thank you for your service. Just earlier this week, wrapping up your U.S. Army stint. I imagine that a lot of people listening to this, watching us, are aware of that, but something to be very proud of. So again, thank you for all that, and really excited for what you're doing with the pod and the rest of your career moving forward. It's going to be a pretty interesting switch, I imagine.
Yeah, no, first off, just appreciate the kind words. It's exciting going to be moving here shortly, heading off to Arizona State. For those who don't know, I mean, I've put that out there. I'll be majoring in sports journalism. So definitely excited. I'll be doing the podcast now on the West Coast, so even further away from Florida, but we're still going to have a good time. And this episode is going to be a good time because we have a lot to dig into. First off, we're going to talk about how Miami has started to develop their players, both in a positive way, but there's also some signs of regression from some individuals. Because when it comes down to it, Eli, the way I looked at this season in 2025 is I wanted to win. Of course, who doesn't want the Marlins to win? They got off to a surprisingly good start, but, it's kind of regression back to the mean. They're now sitting well under 500, and the focus is more shifted to individual players than overall team success. What I want to start by asking you is, who's been the biggest surprise at a positive level in terms of their individual development to potentially be, part of this team's core or the foreseeable future at the minimum?
That's a good question, because you go back a few weeks and everybody's obvious answer was Kyle Stowers, going from how much he struggled last year into what he's done this year. And as we get further along, even though it's been a successful season compared to expectations with him, you still see some of the same red flags that held him back in the first place, mainly when it comes to swing and miss, which means that it kind of just opens it up to going in a lot of different directions there. I mean, we've seen glimpses where we're talking before another Edward Cabrera start. And even though the overall numbers from Eddie look very similar to what he's done in the past, he's made some very tangible adjustments to his game in a way that I actually am somewhat optimistic about. Again, he doesn't feel like the right answer because of he's fooled us before with his up and down and all these adjustments he's made through the years. So that's a really good open-ended question right there in terms of who in particular has like really solidified themselves. It's been, fortunately, there've been some carryover from last year when it comes to somebody like Xavier Edwards, who blew past everybody's expectations offensively last year. And I think overall, you zoom out on this season where he's close to a league average hitter, and all of a sudden putting him back at second base, which is something that people were clamoring for. That's been a good fit for him in a way that I think he's taken steps to, even if I don't know what the backup plan is if he doesn't stick at second base, but he's a guy that when he first came up right around a year ago at this time, when he took that everyday job at shortstop at the time, I think relative to that, the fact that he makes really great swing decisions and just the way that for the most part, he understands exactly who he is as a player, even with his limitations, and makes the most out of it. That's been pretty encouraging as we get further along here. Just as it's something that I was reflecting on with X, even though this season you'd say overall has been a disappointment for him. It is carried over some of the positive aspects from last year in a way that I think is important for him to be a guy that at the very least is a solid everyday second baseman that bats near the top of your lineup, that's still something useful. So I'm all over the map, but there's you pick and choose a lot of different areas of guys that have been solid in a way that on the offensive standpoint, like this has been a better offensive team than we thought it was coming into the year. And it's because a lot of guys are making some little strides in that area.
Yeah, one of the players I want to focus on is Liam Hicks. We're going to touch more about the catcher situation in a little bit, but in terms of just development, he's been a really awesome surprise. You know, coming over from the Rule 5 draft, hadn't played above the Double A level, and for a hitter, I mean that's a lot. That's really hard to do. You're facing a huge increase in terms of skill sets with the opposing pitchers, and he's held his own and more than held his own. He's been really good. The one thing with Liam Hicks that I want to see is more playing time. But I look at the overall profile because he can catch, he can play first base. He had minor league experience. Obviously, the Marlins saw that and decided to give him some time at first, you know, just to keep his bat in the lineup. I look at Liam and I think this guy could be here for a while. You know, given the volatility of Nick Fortes's future, I don't think Nick Fortes is going to be here in the long run. Liam Hicks, he just continues to hit. And there's been instances in which Clayton McCullough will pinch hit Nick Fortes for Liam. And I don't really understand it at some points because Liam can hit lefties. Like he's not horrible against lefties. It's one of those situations where I think it's a positive thing for the future where you can take an unexpected player and then say, okay, wow, we might have something here. Much like last year with Otto Lopez, low expectations, if any expectations at all, and then out of nowhere they just start to perform.
Yeah, with Hicks, it's complicated because from a production standpoint to this point, he's probably the best answer to your previous question in terms of a surprise. There's just, I think I understand why his playing time is as limited as it is. And it's frustrating because he has earned more playing time, it seems, with how well he's done in his opportunities. It's just the underlying skill set. When you look under the hood and you can see somewhat of a cliff coming, but the fact that he just doesn't hit the ball particularly hard. He makes great his discipline has been awesome in the decisions that he makes, and situationally he comes through in a lot of spots. But man, like he's one of those guys that to this point, any way you slice it, he's somebody that's been getting a little luckier than you would expect just based on the quality of contact that he's making. And the big question is defensively, what do you do there? Now it's not like there's anybody blocking him from, as we'll get into shortly. There's going to be some opportunities to catch moving forward. The thing is, even though he's good as a blocker, but I think the other aspects of his defense still have some room to be desired. They've tried that experiment at first base. I was excited about that initially, where I think it's just a week and a half ago that he starts playing first base a little bit. With Matt Mervis gone, he's the guy that could be, at the very least, the backup first baseman, it would seem, to Eric Wagaman. And they've only gone back to that well a couple of times because even in a really small sample, you see limitations there. He's a 5'9" guy that doesn't have a lot of experience there. And he's a liability defensively at that spot, which kind of just limits him to being catcher. And in this organization that has Joe Mack knocking on the door, we're expecting him up next year to likely be the primary catcher that they have moving forward. And they know that with Augustine, even though his overall numbers are not as good as Liam Hicks's are, the upside there is pretty obvious in terms of how he hits the ball and at times the streaks of awesomeness that he's had that I just don't think Hicks is fully capable of. So they're in that, and it's a good problem to have that this is a guy who's a Rule 5 draft pick, which is a glorified waiver claim, essentially, as somebody that now should have some tangible value somewhere. It's just hard to see it being anything more than a backup catcher moving forward, a guy that in this particular organization could see himself on the shuttle up and down from AAA, just depending on how the roster aligns around him. It's been a nice pickup, and it is unusual that what was crazy is how heavy his playing time was early on. Fortes missing some time due to injury, and Augustine was not quite ready at that early point of the season, and how drastically it has gone down despite, as you said, the production that he's had. So it's an interesting spot where he's been a lot better than expected, but at the same time, it's pretty apparent just by how he's being used that the organization's view of him hasn't changed all that much. It's pretty weird that they're not at least they're not finding ways to really reward him for what he's done so far. Instead, they're already in their mind thinking about what he can't do.
We're going to take a more in-depth look at Hicks, at the rest of the catchers, including Augustine Ramirez and Nick Fortes, and as you mentioned, Joe Mack, who's waiting in the wings in AAA, and also talk about Dane Myers, because I think Dane Myers has been the best offensive player for the Marlins to date. That's all coming up right after this. And this episode is brought to you by our friends at Trade Coffee. Let's be real, coffee isn't just a drink. It's a ritual, a lifeline. It's the thing that gets you from half asleep to fully functioning. And when it's that essential, why would you settle for anything less than amazing? That's where Trade Coffee comes in. Whether you're gearing up for your meetings, shuttling your kids to school, tackling an endless to-do list, your morning sets the tone for it all, and that's why it should start with the perfect cup of coffee, Trade. Trade is the #1 coffee destination in the U.S., delivering fresh, incredible coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. And what happens with Trade that's really exciting is you can go online, you can take a quiz, it's a 1-minute quiz, and they're going to personalize your very own coffee order. I took one, and they sent me this bag right here. It's got rich chocolate, cinnamon, toffee, and plum comforting. It smells amazing. The coffee tastes great. And it's exactly what I wanted, because I wanted something sweet. I wanted something aromatic. And if you want to try this out, you take this quiz, you get your coffee sent to you. If you don't like it, they're going to replace it for free until they get it just right. Right now, Trade is exclusively offering our customers 50% off your 1-month trial at drinktrade.com/lockedonmlb. That's trade.com/lockedonmlb for 50% off your 1-month trial. drinktrade.com/lockedonmlb. Back here with Ely Sussman from Fish on First for the second segment of the show. I appreciate all the everyday listeners out there. And let's talk a little bit more about the catchers, because I think it's really unique what the Marlins have been doing, at least for the last month and a half, when they're carrying 3 catchers on the active roster. And that's tough already as it is to incorporate 2 catchers into the rotation and get consistent playing time. And now 3, we're having guys play first. We're having guys DH, rotate between different pitchers and the pitching staff. Who are you most comfortable with? But when I look at this from an overall, a higher standpoint for the bigger picture of the end of this year and heading into next year, I don't know exactly what the Marlins' plans are for all of these guys. I want to say Nick Fortes is the odd man out. We talked about Liam Hicks potentially sticking around as a backup. I mean, he's been a great surprise. Augustine Ramirez, we've talked before. We both still feel like he's not going to stick there defensively. And then you factor in one of your top prospects, arguably your top offensive prospect in Joe Mack. Where do you kind of just view this situation as a whole?
The short story is I come to the same place that you're at in terms of Fortes being the likely odd man out. He's already in his arbitration years, and we've now been a couple years in a row now, really ever since the first half of his rookie season. It's been underwhelming offensively from a guy that actually has very good bat to ball skill and overall offensive talent. He hasn't quite hit that level of performance in a way that makes him all that important to keep around. The wrinkle this year has been that pitchers are working much better with Fortes than anybody else on this team, if you just want to judge by that for whatever it's worth, in terms of the game calling decisions he makes, his ability as a defensive catcher in ways that are sometimes difficult to measure. I think it stems some innings from really getting away from these guys. Whereas with the rookies behind the plate, it's been more common that you see these big blow up endings happen, whether it's directly their fault or not. Fortes is a guy that has some value that shouldn't be taken for granted, and that actually does have minor league options left, even if he's not an important part of your team moving forward. But that being said, especially with Mack as that additional body coming up behind these guys, it's a logjam there. Fortes, they've dabbled with him playing first base earlier in his career and didn't really stick. It's just the fit there it's very crowded, and the way that Peter Bendix operates a front office and has been part of front offices when he was with the Rays, it's usually the highest paid player and the guy with the least remaining service time that's the odd man out, especially if you could get anything in return. That's the unfortunate side of this. Is realistically, I don't think you could get a whole lot other than unloading his money and getting some sort of lottery ticket prospect from an organization, depending on who needs it most. With Fortes, he's probably the odd man out, and then you just work with the rest of the guys that you got in there and try to figure it out in between. Like, this would be, I think it's hard to imagine this lasting throughout the entire year. As what you mentioned, it's been surprising that they've gone quite this long, a full quarter of the season, basically, with 3 catchers on their roster. And the reality is there just haven't been other position players at Jacksonville slamming on the door for an opportunity. Like, they may have been willing to force a Fortes trade or makes a bigger decision there if there was another prospect that needed playing time right now at the big league level. And unfortunately, none of those guys have really been forcing the issue right now in a way that these 3 guys that are on their roster now, and Hicks, Gus, and Fortes, they're 3 of their best 13 position players. They all deserve to be on the team at the same time. And it's created this interesting, complicated playing time equation where I feel like in some ways that Gus has been denied an opportunity to prove people wrong. They have not given him very many opportunities to catch, especially as this has gone further on. He has settled in as close to an everyday DH who catches about twice a week. Even though there's understandable skepticism in terms of that actually working, this was supposed to be the year before Mac comes up, where he's supposed to get that runway to try to get better and try to prove himself wrong. So that is, I think, as we get deeper into the year, I think that makes a whole lot of sense for everybody involved, where they ship Fortes to whatever contending team can use a better backup catcher. And I think there are a few that seem as an upgrade, and then really lean into finding out what you have in Hicks and with Gus. As we mentioned earlier with Hicks, he has stuff to prove as an offensive player. There's a reason why they don't seem to buy into the results he has so far, but this is the perfect time to give him that opportunity to figure it out and to go back to a traditional 2-catcher setup where both of those guys are playing a lot. I think that would make a whole lot of sense for the second half of the season.
And then I think the beginning of 2026, we go into spring training and in opening day next year, there's a real chance Joe Mack is on the opening day roster, given, he's in AAA right now. He's been struggling a little bit. I think it's an adjustment level, but the tools are still there. And I'd be shocked if he's not in big league camp again this season and have an opportunity, especially if they do move on from Fortes. One of the other players I wanted to mention was Dane Myers. The Marlins view Dane Myers in a very strange way because they treat him like a random waiver claim. I mean, he was a Rule 5 pick. He wasn't a heralded prospect by any means, but he's done nothing but hit all season. I mean, his average right now is 331 in a decent sample size. He's well over 100 at-bats. I think Dane Myers is the best offensive player this season for Miami. I know he's not the most exciting because Agustin Ramirez has the name value, being a top prospect in the Yankees system, coming over here, all the expectations with him. But Dane Myers does nothing but hit. He has a cannon of an arm. I'm trying to find a weakness or a reason to expect this to just fall off a cliff, in terms of production. And I can't think of any good reason, nor do I want there to be one. And now we're talking about other fan bases noticing this. The Padres are going, hey, look at this guy, Dane Myers. He's going to be cheap. He's 29, 30 years old. We'll solve our corner outfield position. Dane Myers might not be here for the next competitive Marlins season because at some point, I think he's going to play himself, whether it's this season or realistically, I think it's going to be next year's trade deadline as a potential trade piece, just given the time frame. How do you view Dane Myers? Should Marlins fans be as optimistic as I am with his production?
I like him a lot. Another variable there, what you made a point of is with his offense is true. The surprise to me about him has really been the defense. As a guy that a converted pitcher coming up through the minors, he was hitting at a very high level, even when the Marlins acquired him as a minor league Rule 5 pick, he was barely playing center field in the minors. He was in the corner outfield spots and even the corner infield spots, and that was really ugly. There was really some question in terms of whether he had a position, like when they called him up 2 years ago for the first time, and all of a sudden now he's a plus defensive center fielder. Like he always had the athleticism for that. His arm is outstanding, but overall, just fundamentally, he's been great over there in a way that does make him the best player on the team when he's been on the field this year. And as you mentioned, his playing time, especially early on, was really frustrating, treating him as a small side platoon bat where he was starting against lefties. And then he was usually coming off the bench on other days. And sometimes he wasn't even doing that. And finally, they partly due to injuries to Derek Hill, part of it due to Kyle Stowers taking a step back. I mean, now Dane, you need to give them credit. He's been playing every day the last several weeks, every single day, with one exception when he got hit by that pitch. And physically, they gave him a day off. Otherwise, as we record this, he'd started like 13 of their last 14 games, aside from that injury one. I'm glad that finally happened because he deserved it. So he's in an interesting spot just because of how old he is. He is 29 years old. And it's unusual for somebody with this limited track record to already be that far along age-wise. And for somebody that is still, the athleticism is a big part of his game. It's the reason why he's able to both offensively and defensively in a way that you wonder how that's going to age. Like by the time he reaches free agency, he might be 33 years old. And that is why, even though there's so much club control left, and even though he is earning the league minimum, inevitably you would have to think of him as a possible trade chip just because he's really valuable. And he's a guy that you could fit on any team because he could play every outfield position, because he is hitting right-handers better than originally thought. So, I mean, there's little things that will drag him down over time. I think he has the highest batting average on balls in play in baseball this year among guys that have played as often as he did. So in some ways, there is a luck factor that I mentioned with Hicks, even though with Dane, he hits the ball hard, but at the same time, it's not a lot of long fly balls. It's ones that if guys are positioned in the right spots, you would think that evens out a little bit, where if he hits anywhere close to 300 by the end of the year as an everyday player, that'd be a win. I think realistically, that is where you see some regression coming in his batting average. Overall, though, like still a great find, a great part of this team. And as long as he's on the team, considering what else has happened around their outfield, I think for this year, I'd love to hold on to him. Jesus Sanchez is the one that makes a lot more sense as a trade chip, just to clear out the outfield even more for somebody like Dane to play every single day.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think with every game that goes by and Jesus Sanchez performs well, that just elevates his stock. There's going to be a couple teams at the deadline that need an outfielder, need a platoon outfielder that can hit righties. And that's what Sanchez has made a career out of, mashing righties, sitting against lefties, and just, playing the game with a smile on his face. The last thing I'll say with Dane, though, because we've talked about this a couple months ago when he was just tearing it up. And I'm thinking, look, he is 29 years old. There's going to be outfield needy teams. Do you move on from him? I don't think you should trade him just to trade him, because if the production is real, then you're going to expect the same thing next year. And then you're in a better position in terms of track record and overall production to get a better return. Because ultimately, I do think this team is a couple years away from contention, just remotely close to being considered contenders. In my mind, the calendar is circled at 2027 is where I want to see this team with a winning record at the minimum. Of course, these timetables change and everything's fluid. There's so many variables that go into these rebuilds, but one of the variables is, of course, the Major League Baseball draft. Last year, the Marlins made a couple interesting picks. I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about their new approach, because I'm excited for what Frankie Pilieri and the rest of the Marlins, draft team is going to do in a very interesting draft. There's really no cold cut answer as to who's going number 1 at this point, and for the Marlins at number 7. So we're going to talk about the Marlins draft approach and where we think they should go right after this. And this episode is brought to you by Gametime. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with your friends or your family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to go, you want to be there in the stands. And that's exactly where Gametime comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you're going to save on those tickets, you can get food, drinks, merchandise, whatever you want. Gametime makes that possible because they make buying tickets fast and simple. When you're on the app, the prices drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Gametime, guys, is one of my favorite apps to use when it comes to going to a baseball game because of the all-in pricing. When I'm on an app, I want to go to a ball game, I want to see exactly how much I'm going to pay. And that's exactly what happens with Gametime. If it says $30, it's going to be $30. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So Gametime has exclusive deals for big savings, like 10% off for FIFA Club World Cup matchups. That's coming up in a couple of years. So if you're a soccer fan as well, take a look at that. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Back here with Ely Sussman, third segment. We're talking about the Marlins draft. I want to start by kind of reviewing last year's draft because that kind of gets swept under the rug, and I was very vocal last season when it came to the PJ Morlando pick. They went under slot because they wanted to save money to sign Carter Johnson away from an Alabama commit. I love the Carter Johnson pick at the time, but now we fast forward about a full calendar year. Carter Johnson's hitting under the Mendoza line. PJ Morlando hasn't been able to stay on the field at all. And you look at who they could have taken. You know, I think of like Carson Benj or Ryan Waldschmidt, Slade Caldwell. I'm like, man, the Marlins really could have had a high impact offensive talent in their system. They can't let a situation like that happen again this year. Let me know your thoughts on last year's draft and then what you want to see out of the Marlins approach at pick number 7.
Man, you summed it up pretty quickly on the top two guys, where most of their draft will went to, you could essentially consider them co-first round picks in Morlando and Johnson. Morlando on just as a draft prospect alone, he would have gone lower, all things being equal, and Carter Johnson would have gone a little bit higher if there weren't some signability questions. And so the Marlins kind of split the difference, and they end up spending a similar amount of money on both guys, and both of them have been disappointments. With Morlando, a lot of it because of injury. But just like you, I was not a fan of that pick. It was a guy where you saw obvious upside in certain places, but just an overall question about his hit tool and whether he can hit. And to this point in his minor league career, he's drawn a lot of walks, and that's about it. And there's still a question in terms of whether he can actually hit. And unfortunately, due to his injuries, we're almost a full year removed from that, and he's played just a handful of games at low A, and the rest just rehabbing. In the meantime, with Carter Johnson, I thought his hit tool was better, and I thought it was a higher floor guy, and instead he's been awful in terms of like his, even more so than Morlando, his swing and miss issues and swing decisions right now are a lot farther behind than I thought they would be. Still plenty of time in both cases. Low A Jupiter is famously a very tough place to hit for young guys, so I'm not willing to write those off as cold, clear mistakes. Right now, it is on the other side of it just frustrating that this team, I know through sources that they were very locked in to Cam Smith if he was available at 16. He didn't quite get there. He was picked a couple spots ahead, then got traded. Now he's in the big leagues. And as we're speaking right now, he's going through an amazing hot stretch that has gotten his overall numbers back to, like, he's already an above average major league everyday player a year removed from the draft. So that contrast is very frustrating. And if like spinning ahead to this year, fortunately, there's going to be a lot more talent to choose from because they're number 7 overall instead of number 16. That's a big part of it. I don't want to totally gloss over the other picks they've made because some of those guys have been doing well. They went with a lot of college bats immediately after Morlando and Johnson, and some of those guys already having a lot of success. Fenwick Trimble is already at Double-A. Unfortunately, he's hurt right now with a hamstring issue, but still has a half season or so at the Double-A level to show that He's a fast mover through the system. They have Peyton Green, I think the 6th round pick that year. He's been awesome at high A, and he could find himself in Pensacola very soon, within the next month or so. So that's a guy who's playing shortstop for now. I don't know if he's going to stick there, but the way that he's hitting, they'll be able to find a spot for him if he's flirting with a 900 OPS in his first full season coming out of college. And some of their other arms have moved on a couple ends. We should also mention that Aiden May was the first pitcher that they selected, and he's been out due to injury this entire year. Should get on the mound later this summer, but don't know what they have in him. So it's still a very incomplete grade from this aspect, where some of these guys that they have had success so far, it seems that their ceiling is a little limited. And the one guy, the couple guys that still have really high ceilings are just not having success to this point. So they were in a tough spot, picking number 16 overall, having a smaller bonus pool than they're accustomed to. That's why this year, some of the excuses that you can make for them don't apply this season. They should be having, by all accounts, a more impactful draft class in 2025 than they did in 2024.
When I look at the 2025 draft, I really think the Marlins should go with a position player, a young position player. I look at someone like Billy Carlson Jr. or, Eli Willits, JoJo Parker. 3 of those guys just prep shortstops with real high upside, very athletic. The issue is, are they going to fall to number 7? Because you have Pittsburgh, you have St. Louis. Both those teams are directly ahead of you, and they've both been directly tied to a high upside shortstop. Now, the X factor, I think, is Oliva Arquette. Now, might butcher his name, but shortstop out of Oregon State. He's a huge shortstop. I don't think he's going to be a shortstop long term. I'd be hard pressed to imagine at 6'5" he's going to stick around. But there's so many different options the Marlins can go with. If Arquette falls, do you get that college bat? Do you want to go that approach? What if Seth Hernandez, a prep right-hander? I know the risk with a prep right-hander in the draft is always there, but he's so talented. Do they want to take a chance on him and just kind of put him in your pitching factory and let them go to work? I still think when I look at the Marlins farm system, the one thing that's really lacking is position players, like true talent, blue chip prospects at that level. We have Joe Mack. Starlin Caba is the other high upside guy, but he's had 1 extra base hit since July of last year, and he's on the 60-day injured list. Like, I don't think you can just push all your chips onto Starlin Caba and Joe Mack and say, well, we got 2 studs at 2 premium positions. I still think their best option is to either go with a prep shortstop, either go with Arquette if he does fall to 7, and then just really hone in on developing bats. It's plagued the Marlins for years. You have an entire new system implemented. This is your second draft, with Frankie Pilier running the show. This is where the rubber meets the road. You have to execute this at a high level.
Yeah, I largely agree with what you mentioned there. In fact, I had basically the same 3 names circled on the prep side between Carlson and between JoJo Parker and also Eli Willits. Those same 3 ones that there's a good chance one of them falls to 7. I wouldn't say that I would insist on them having to go with a position player with that top pick. It's just that's kind of how this class lines up, where if you look at the prep pitching side, it's Seth Hernandez, and then there's a pretty significant drop off, and they don't expect Seth Hernandez to be available when they're picking at 7. So in some ways, I think that's just a reflection of who's available in this particular class. And also just my sense is that compared to the previous amateur scouting department, that this one is more model driven. And what that really means in one way that manifests itself is when you see the approach to college bats, where naturally those guys, several of them will go very early on, including Arquette, but teams that are more model driven will look for guys, lesser known players and less decorated players that have a lot of the same attributes, that have the same swing decisions and some of the same exit velocities, and just try to replicate them later in the draft at a much lower price, and feeling that they might actually have comparable careers despite having less hype around them. So you saw that in some aspects with last year's draft class and some of those college bats, but like Trimble and Peyton Green, et cetera, guys that fell quite a bit and were a lot cheaper than first round picks, but early on in their pro careers are having very encouraging results. I think that could be somewhat of a trend regardless of the particular class throughout moving forward. You could see that quite a bit where they stock up on college bats during day 2 of the draft. And in day 1, I think they will be chasing upside. And usually that does come in the form of prep players. So yeah, a lot of the same names are the ones that are circling in my mind. We've gone through 18 draft profiles on our site already, 18 potential first round picks. And I'm sure at this point that the Marlins brain trust has zeroed in on a more selective group than that to this point. But it just goes to show you that a lot of things can happen. And money is always a big factor here, where if you have an opportunity to get somebody well under slot value, but that you really like, and that won't make it till your second pick, then it's not always the best talent available. It's really about making sure the class itself has as much talent overall. And ultimately, there is some restrictions in terms of how much you can spend on individual picks because of the draft bonus pool system, which means you see some creative things. It's just that you don't want them to overthink it. And last year, with the top pick, at least it felt like the Marlins overthought things, that they saved some money right there. They were able to spread it out in later rounds, but ultimately they felt like they could have done a whole lot better with who else was available at the top pick. So it's a difficult balancing act where you're trying to plan across all 20 rounds, making sure you use as much money available, and you want to spread out, you diversify your portfolio, which is how a lot of these guys actually refer to balancing draft bonus pool, but you don't want to overthink it. And in this year, more so than last year, they're in a position where with that top pick, they you shouldn't get too cute. You should just try to take a high upside prep player, like the guys we mentioned that's available at that pick. And I don't think you hesitate to pull the trigger there and then address all those other later round picks as you get to them.
And we'll wrap it up right here. Eli, go ahead and promote, what you guys are doing at Fish on First, because it's great work.
Yeah. Wherever you find Fish on First, you'll find me behind the scenes or in front of the scenes. Well, it's as much in-person coverage as we can of this Marlins team, both the majors and the minors, streaming before every single series, mixing in interviews between that before and after on our podcast channel, Fish on First, wherever you get your podcasts as well. And so you can find all our offerings, fishonfirst.com. Every single day, we got new coverage for you, analyzing this team across all levels. And we're really entering the most fun time of year between the draft and the trade deadline. As disappointed as some people might be about the lack of wins at the major league level, at least this team has a clear direction in terms of what they're going to be doing at the deadline. They're going to be selling off some pieces, and we'll be covering all the rumors and all the ramifications of that for you guys at FOF.
Awesome. And Eli, thanks again for coming on, man. It's always great talking some Marlins baseball with you and having these discussions.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Jeremiah.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Marlins. As always, guys, stay safe, stay locked on, and let's go.